it's so important we understand the power of movements. Cindy Sheehan didn't do this alone. She came out of a movement, and she inspires an ever larger movement. She went to Crawford. It wasn't even particularly a very planned act last summer. She was speaking at the Veterans for Peace Convention in Dallas on August 5th and said she couldn't enjoy another vacation after losing her son, 40404. That's April 4th, 2004. Her son, Casey. They named the encampment at Crawford Camp Casey. And so she said, I can't enjoy another vacation, so I'll go to Crawford, where the president was on one of the longest vacations in presidential history. And she said she'd go to ask for an hour of his time to ask him a question. For what noble cause did my son die? And she picked up the next morning. She wasn't even sure where Crawford was, but she knew she was in Texas, so she'd eventually make it. And she took up in a ditch outside the presidential estate. It's not really a ranch, so we won't call it that. And she sat there and just kept repeating this question. Now, a lot of press were there, the embedded press, the White House press corps, but beware of even that press. When the president is unavailable in 110-degree weather and they have nothing to do, and there is this persistent, relentless voice asking the same question. And you see the power of the question when the press picks it up. They said to Cindy, you're so eloquent, you're so articulate. Why haven't you spoken out before? She had been speaking out for more than a year at that time. In fact, she was one of those mothers who had tried to reach Donald Rumsfeld at the Pentagon. They had called ahead. They said they wanted to meet with him on the eve of the inauguration of President Bush, 2005 in January. Remember, cold winter, that inauguration. And a group of them, along with Celeste Zapala, who lost her son Sherwood Baker in Pennsylvania, the first National Guardsman to die in Iraq since World War II, they tried to go to the Pentagon to meet the Secretary of Defense, and they weren't met by an envoy from the Pentagon to bring them in to have a conversation, these grieving mothers. They were met by the security in all black at gunpoint in the Pentagon parking lot and turned around. So Cindy had been doing this for a while, trying to talk with those who had sent her son to his death. So she sat there, and the press started to ask that question. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported what President Bush finally answered. He said, when asked, why don't you meet with this grieving mother, he said, I have to get on with my life too. I think it was quoted in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. What he did that day, 2-hour mountain bike ride, went to a Little League game, did some fishing, napped, and maybe actually did some reading, they said, that day. But he didn't have time to meet with Cindy Sheehan. And her action galvanized so many. Hundreds and thousands of people came to Crawford, particularly women who lost their children in Iraq. Democracy Now! Went to Crawford. We broadcast from the side of the ditch right at Camp Casey. And we talked to, for example, Nadja McCaffrey from right outside of Sacramento. She lost her son, Patrick. It was after 9/11, and he said he wanted to give back to his country, be there in a time of catastrophe, be there to help out, and then he was deployed to Iraq. Didn't know what to do because he didn't see the connection, how this would help protect his country. Didn't see a connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. And he sat with his mother for hours, but ultimately decided he couldn't abandon his buddies. And so he went to Iraq, and he was killed. Actually, we just talked to Nadja McCaffrey 2 years later, and it was on the second anniversary of his death that she learned that the military had lied to her about how her son had died. Just like with Pat Tillman, he was so high profile. He went to Afghanistan. His family lied to. Ultimately, they learned he was killed with, quote, friendly fire. But what Nadja learned about her son was that he was killed by the Iraqi soldiers he was training. And she had already engaged in a defiant act. You know, President Bush has invoked this executive order that says you can't film, videotape, photograph the flag-draped coffins or body bags of soldiers coming home. And as she waited for her son's casket at Sacramento International Airport, she invited all the press to come and snap those pictures, roll that film, document what happened to her son. She said he didn't leave under cover of darkness. He's not going to come back that way. So she had already done that. Last night we were in Minneapolis, and there, Minnesota, one of the people running for governor is a state legislator named Becky Laurie. Becky Laurie, state legislator we wrote about in Democracy in Static, because she's another of those mothers that went to Crawford. We had read about her in the Pioneer Press. Last year I had gone to give the commencement address at Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin, and it was Memorial Day weekend, and I picked up the paper as we were driving up, and there was a headline that said "Death in the Family." And it was about the state legislator who had introduced a resolution before the war, the invasion, against the war. But it wasn't about that. It was about the fact that her son Matt had died in Iraq 2 Memorial Day weekends ago. And Becky Lurie, when we talked to her, interviewed her, said, as she talked about all the young people who were dying, she said, who are going to be our leaders? I think these women who have nothing left to lose, Becky, Cindy, Nadja, these are the future leaders. Beware of mothers who have nothing left to lose. And speaking of women who have launched movements, this past year we lost a giant, Rosa Parks. Right, December 1st, 1955, she sits down on the bus in Montgomery. Bus driver tells her to stand up. She refuses for a white passenger, and she helps to launch the modern-day civil rights movement. Now, there is a case where the media did something right, the corporate media. The reporters went down. The reporters reported on the importance of Rosa Parks. And I think we watched it all on television when she died, how significant she was. But they did get something wrong. They said here she was, just a tired seamstress who sat down on the bus, who had just had enough. She was no troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. She was a first-class troublemaker. The media seems to think that being part of a movement, being an activist, delegitimizes you. But it's the opposite. To dedicate your life to improving the world is such an incredible commitment. And that is one that Rosa Parks had made. She was secretary of the local NAACP. The president was Edie Nixon, came out of longtime labor politics. She had been to the Highlander Center, was practiced in strategizing about the most effective way of achieving a more just end. She had, in fact, sat down on the bus and refused to get up before. But this moment was just key. And that's always important to remember. What will be the tipping point? What will be that opportunity? You never know. You can't predict the future, but you just commit yourself to living your life justly and being involved. And that's what Rosa Parks did. And it was quite profound what happened. And to show the power of what she did and the bravery, think about the time, 1955. In fact, just a few months before in Money, Mississippi, Emmett Till, 14 years old, little boy from Chicago, had gone down to be with his family for the summer. His mother, Mamie Till, had sent him down for a summer vacation, and he was killed by, well, the Klan, basically, in that community. The murder has never actually been properly investigated or solved 50 years later. And when he died, when he was thrown into the Tallahatchie River, destroyed, brutalized, she insisted when the coffin, the casket came up to Chicago, that it be open at the wake and the funeral. Emmett's head, 5, 10 times larger than it should have been. She said she wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. And thousands streamed past that casket, and they saw. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications showed the images, did the right thing, what the press should do, go to where the silence is, no matter how heinous, and show, reflect what is happening. Incredibly brave woman, Mamie Till Mobley. I think Mamie Till Mobley and Rosa Parks together launched the modern-day civil rights movement. Showing the images, the media should follow the example. I was supposed to come here last year, incredibly frustrated that I couldn't, but I was down in New Orleans at the time of the Fighting Bob Fest because of the horror of Katrina, this natural catastrophe that was made so much so much worse by an administration, the criminal, reckless neglect of the administration. I mean, you had President Bush, right, at Crawford. He actually left Crawford that week, but not to go back to work. He went to California. The press photographed him strumming on the guitar of a country music singer. I think his name is Gary Wills. His signature song was Wish You Were Here. Could have been the theme song of the people of New Orleans. But it wasn't just President Bush who didn't respond. Vice President Cheney, fly fishing in Wyoming, kept on his vacation. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice came to our city, New York, where she took in a Broadway play, Spamalot. We're talking Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, right? The levees, the hurricane, Monday and Tuesday. This is Wednesday and Thursday. Went to Spamalot, went shopping at Ferragamo, the high-end shoe store. A customer shouted at her, "What are you doing here when people are drowning in New Orleans?" And they took her out, the customer, that is. And then she went to play tennis with Monica Seles. And then there was Andrew Card, then the chief of staff, former GM lobbyist. He was vacationing in New England, former GM lobbyist. What we've seen in Washington is the ascendancy of the oligarchy. President Bush, a failed oil man himself, Vice President Cheney, former head of the largest oil services corporation in the world, right on down the line to Andrew Card, which is why we see what we're seeing, the behavior, the invasion of Iraq, which is why we see the attitude we do to Venezuela. These are the key spots, sort of reminds you of the little boy who said to his father that joke, "What's our oil doing under their sand?" But here you have this horrific event that takes place, a city drowning with no federal response. The media did go down to New Orleans. Again, they did the right thing. And side effect of Bush not sending in the troops was that there were no troops to embed with. And so you saw, for the first time, media reporting from a victim's perspective. We saw on the TV screen bodies floating by. It was astounding. A young woman interviewing a man who had walked up in the water holding his boy's hand said he had just been holding his wife's hand, and as she slipped away, she said, "Take care of the children." And then he walked off in shock into the water, and the young reporter started to cry. We rarely see this on television. And then the effect of that was when the government said, "We are here. We are taking care of the people." Of course, the reporter said, "No, you're not. We're here. You're not." And it really was astounding. It horrified the nation to see these accurate images of what was happening there. It didn't matter your political perspective, conservative, Republican, Democrat, independent. It didn't matter. People were horrified when they saw the truth. And they were galvanized to action. You think if for just 1 week we saw the images on the ground in Iraq of what's truly happening there, If we saw the babies dead on the ground, the women with their legs blown off from cluster bombs, we saw the soldiers dead and dying for 1 week in Iraq. Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. We need an unembedded media, an independent, international, grassroots, global media, and that's what we're trying to build in this country, bringing together all the different media. I mean, here in Wisconsin, you have some amazing media outlets. Yes, WORT, you have the Progressive here in Madison, Wisconsin, and all of the different radio, TV, low-power FM, public radio, public television. We have to put the public back in all of these institutions because it's very much under threat. But we have to build it and fortify it. But going back to that night in Provincetown and meeting Carlos Arredondo, and talking about Katrina, he didn't tell you about his younger son, Brian, except that he learned about his brother's death on his father's birthday by watching television. He's being seriously recruited by the National Guard to go to Iraq, to the horror of his parents. They've already lost their first son. And Carlos showed me a letter that he had gotten, his son had gotten. It said, "Dear American." This was from the National Guard. Which reminds me, by the way, Carlos is not an American citizen. He's from Costa Rica, where they don't have an army. But he's tried to become an American citizen for years now. I mean, here is a man who's given the greatest sacrifice to his country. He's lost his son, but he himself has not been able to become an American citizen. Even that hasn't put him at the head of the line. But here his son, Brian, who was 17 when he learned of his brother's death, now 19, gets this letter, "Dear American," and it talks about, at the beginning of the letter, how important it is to join to serve your country in situations like Hurricane Katrina. If only the National Guard were here in this country to help the people of New Orleans. Instead, they were in Iraq. And then a couple paragraphs down, I wrote it down because it was the original letter. The letter says, "You could be eligible for an enlistment bonus of up to $20,000 for joining the National Guard. What can you do with $20,000? A new car, pay off credit cards, help your family? It's up to you. It'll be your money earned by making a commitment to serve your country." And then it goes on to say, this National Guard letter, "Remember, the decision you make right now will have a huge impact on how the rest of your life turns out." Which is why Brian's parents are trying to ensure he doesn't go to Iraq. Which brings me to a section of static in our chapter called Anti-Warriors, about the soldiers who've resisted, the part where we talk about students in the crosshairs. As recruiters go bottom-feeding to meet quota, the Pentagon's busy creating a high-tech database to reach out and snare unsuspecting students. First, there was the obscure provision of the No Child Left Behind Act that forces high schools to turn over the names and contact details of all juniors and seniors, effectively transforming President George Bush's signature education bill into the most aggressive military recruitment tool since the draft. Then in June 2005, privacy advocates were shocked to learn that for 2 years, the Pentagon had been amassing a database of information on some 30 million students. The information dossiers on millions of young Americans were to help identify college and high school students as young as 16 to target them for military recruiting. The massive database includes an array of personal information, including birth dates, social security numbers, email addresses, grade point averages, ethnicities, and what subjects the students are studying. The Pentagon has hired the Massachusetts-based company BNow to run the database. By turning to private firms to do this work, the government is circumventing laws that restrict its right to collect or hold citizen information. The Pentagon's Joint Advertising Market Research and Studies Group, known as JAMMERS, oversees this massive data mining project. The Pentagon, which is spending close to $250 million on jammers, is collecting data from commercial data brokers, state driver's license records, and other sources. The jammers website describes the consolidated database located at BNow as arguably the largest repository of 16 to 25-year-old youth data in the country, containing roughly 30 million records. If you're concerned the information might be used by other agencies, well, you should be. The Pentagon has stated it can share the data with law enforcement, state tax authorities, other agencies making employment inquiries, and foreign authorities, among others. Students will not know if their information has been collected, and they cannot prevent it from happening. The main obstacle to getting kids into the military, concerned parents, has at long last been circumvented. Private companies can now harvest data on children and provide private recruiters with the information they need to contact kids directly. If skeptical parents find out that the Mr. Jones calling for Johnny is offering their child a free ticket to Iraq, the military is spending millions to learn how best to persuade or bypass these negative influencers. Parents. One jammer study is focused exclusively on how to change mothers' attitudes. In March 2004, 271 mothers from Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, Dallas, and New York were interviewed in order to enable recruiters to, quote, better understand ways to motivate mothers currently on the fence to be accepting of military service and exert some influence on mothers who are currently against military service. Now rebellious teens have a new ally in challenging their overprotective mothers, the Pentagon. And in case the prospective recruit has dropped out of school, has a criminal record, or is a single parent, each normally a bar to acceptance in the military, Jammers is also studying moral character waiver policies to help recruiters sign them up anyway. Moral character waiver policies. Does the name Stephen Green ring a bell? Stephen Green, the Army private who went to Mahmoudiya along with some other soldiers, and they raped Abir Hamza, the 14-year-old girl. They went to her house, put her mother, father, and 5-year-old sister in a room, executed them, shot them, and then raped, murdered, and burned the body of Abir to cover up the crime. A number of soldiers have now been charged in that crime. Stephen Green had a moral waiver. He had just come out of jail, had been charged with several different misdemeanors, and was sent to Iraq. Mahmoudiya, Haditha, the Marines, saying originally that about 24 Iraqis had died because of a roadside bomb that had killed a fellow Marine, but in fact they went into the homes after the roadside bomb went off and rounded up the family still in their night clothes, still in their pajamas, and executed them. I was with Robert J. Lifton, the great psychiatrist who's written about Nazi doctors and people in wartime at Provincetown, and he was speaking about atrocity-producing situations. I mean, everyone has to be held accountable from the lowest level, but we have to talk about the chain of command. We have to go right to the top when we talk about what is happening in Iraq. 15 minutes, 5 minutes. It is horrifying that this image Americans have, I think, of ourselves is so different than the image people around the world have of us. I'd say the image most people have in this country of the invasion is probably the statue of Saddam Hussein going down, because we saw that statue so many times, thousands of times on television. But what is the image that most people have of Americans? Probably the iconic image would be that the Iraqi prisoner, hood over his head, arms out in Christ-like figure with electrodes dangling from his fingertips, standing on a box. That does not represent the best of America. Just this week, President Bush, launching a new PR campaign, has announced that the U.S. does not engage in torture. If only. if not engaging itself as it has at Abu Ghraib, as it has at Guantanamo, what about this extraordinary term that is now used, extraordinary rendition? What does it mean? Kidnapping. Kidnapping someone off the street or in an airport, family doesn't know what happens to them, and they are gone, sent on a torture flight somewhere. Like, well, where we begin the book with Maher Arar, Syrian Canadian. He's very well known in Canada. People here hardly know who this man is. He was the Time Newsmaker of the Year, Canadian Time. But here, Maher Arar, he's a Syrian Canadian citizen who left Syria when he's like 17. His family fled. He's one of these computer geeks. He works for a Massachusetts-based company in Canada. He was coming back from a family vacation, and he was picked up when he was going in transit through Kennedy Airport. His family was coming a few days later, and he was detained at Metropolitan Detention Facility, and he was ultimately deported to Syria, where he hadn't been in decades, put on one of these so-called torture flights where he was, as the authorities who took him were watching action films, he simply cried all the way to Syria. He said, "They're going to torture me if I am sent back to this country," where he hadn't served military service or just fled. And sure enough, he was held for almost a year in a grave-like cell, and he was brutalized. I mean, the U.S. government says they don't send prisoners to places where they know they are engaged in torture. Yet, how many times has President Bush talked about Syria as part of that axis, the axis of evil, and how sinister it is? And that's where the U.S. government sent this young man to. And after almost a year, he was released. As inexplicably as he was picked up, never charged, and sent back to Canada. A broken man, trying to put his life together, trying to regain his sense of self. We talked to him on Democracy Now!, and it's always the littlest things that get you. He said, "I said to my daughter, all he wants to do is spend time with his family now." He said, my little daughter, I went to pick her up at school, and I said, "Get your things, come with me." And he said, all of a sudden, it reminded him of being in Syria. "Pick up your things, you're coming with me." And he said, it's those little things that continue to break him every single day. He's sued. The Center for Constitutional Rights has sued on his behalf, and the judge has thrown out the case, saying they can't reveal what happened to him, explain it, because it would be a threat to national security. Well, I think they're going to appeal. And that's just one case. How many people were taken off the streets? How many people were taken this way? Never explained. And that's the thing about places like Guantanamo. If these men are guilty, or if you believe they are, have enough evidence, well, you charge them. And if found guilty, they should be severely punished. But here are hundreds of men who have never been charged, never seen the evidence against them. And don't think that if it happens to them now, the most marginalized, the most hated people, it's not going to come closer and closer to you. Remember that famous quote from World War II, Martin Niemöller, the pastor, who said, first they came for the socialists. I wasn't a socialist, so they didn't speak out. I didn't speak out. Then they came for the Jews and the Catholics. I wasn't a Jew or a Catholic, so I didn't speak out. They came for the trade unionists. I was not a trade unionist, so I didn't speak out. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. It's very important that we stand together, so it makes it harder to target any individual. Some of you may have heard our interview with Raed Jarrar. Here's a case, a couple weeks ago this happened. We ran this story, and then it was picked up by all the corporate media. Our motto is, steal this story, please. But Raed Jarrar, he's this Iraqi architect. He's a blogger. Raed, in the middle.blogspot.com, has always had very interesting commentary about what's happening in Iraq, in his home country. He lives in San Francisco. And he gets on a plane from New York to San Francisco, and, well, he tries to get on the plane, but he's stopped by TSA and JetBlue officials. He was going on JetBlue. 4 authorities came up to him, and they said he's not going on that plane wearing that T-shirt. And he said, what T-shirt? And he looked down. He was wearing a black T-shirt with white letters that said, "We will not be silent." And they said, this is a threatening T-shirt. He said, what's threatening about "we will not be silent"? And they said, it's not the English words, it's the Arabic above it. And he said, that's just Arabic for "we will not be silent." And they said, well, we can't be sure of that. We don't have a translator. And he said, has Arabic suddenly become a terrorist language? And one of them said to him, wearing a T-shirt like that on a flight is like walking into a bank with a T-shirt that says, "I am a robber." Well, one of the officials got him a T-shirt to put over his, and he had a seat in the front, but they put him in the very back. Yesterday I was on Al Franken's show, and he said, well, isn't this really an anomaly? It doesn't really happen very often. But the fact is, it's increasingly happening. We had Arwa Ibrahim. She's an Iraqi-American. She had just come back from Amman with her family for summer vacation. Her twin sister, her older sister, her brother, and her mom. They were coming through Kennedy. They were hauled off into a room, and there were hundreds of people of South Asian descent or people speaking Arabic, people. She said it was clear why they were in that room, and she and her family were divided up, and they started to ask her questions like, are you for the war in Iraq? Now, what's this young woman supposed to answer? If she says she's against it, is she considered a terrorist? Will she see her mother again? Will she be deported from a place she is not really familiar with? She grew up here. She's an American citizen. But if she says she's for the war, would that be lying to a federal official? You know, people are sort of put in a bind here. And this kind of targeting, the Muslim doctor from Denver who gets on a flight is praying and he's taken off the flight, or the Arabic-speaking students who were flown from Spain trying to go to Manchester where they go to school and they were told they couldn't get on the flight, or the passengers who said they'd mutiny if a group of Arabic men were allowed on the flight. These are frightening times. And when you marginalize weak populations like this, or targeted populations, that's what increases our national insecurity. That does not make us safer. That's why it's important we stand together. The good part of the story here is just last week we had on a woman named Lori Arbeiter, and she came into our offices the day after we ran Ra'ed Jarrar's story, and she and these other women walked in wearing these black T-shirts, the ones we had just described on the show with the white lettering in English and Arabic. And I said, oh my, what are you doing? They said, well, we're getting on flights today. And I said, where are you going? And they said, well, it doesn't matter. And they went flying and they came back. We called it challenging high-flying profiling. And then when they came back, we put them on the air. Lori actually had given Ra'ed his T-shirt a while ago. He just happened to wear it on that flight. And they are now putting them out. Thousands of orders. I mean, you can see they're not very sophisticated, have some big website. You have to email them at wewillnotbesilent@gmail.com. And they've gotten thousands of orders. They've translated them into Hebrew, into Farsi. You'll often see the Farsi on television. It's got a Latin coverage, you know, saying the Arabic script, and it'll be Farsi. But in Arabic, in Spanish, and French, they're just putting it out in every language. And Lori said they're going to put it out in the original German now. You know where it actually came from, that phrase. It came from the White Rose Collective in Germany in World War II, brother and sister. They weren't Jewish. They were brother and sister with a small group of people. They were students. And they said that the least they could do was let fellow Germans know what was happening so that they wouldn't be able to say we didn't know. And so they started distributing pamphlets. And their fourth pamphlet across the top was written, "We will not be silent," in German. The brother and sister were captured and they were killed. But those words live on today. I want to end by talking about this anniversary that's coming up Monday, the 5th anniversary of September 11th. I fly back to New York tomorrow, and we're going to have a big event in New York on September 11th. Honoring voices of peace and resistance. September 11th, 2001 was a horrific moment. 3,000 people incinerated in an instant. We'll actually never know how many people died on that day, because those who go uncounted in life go uncounted in death, and they were the undocumented workers who worked at the World Trade Center. We should know all their names. We should know their stories. That's what dignifies a life. We were broadcasting Democracy Now! That day, just blocks from Ground Zero. We worked out of the attic of this 100-year-old firehouse. We still work in the firehouse, but we're in the first floor now, where the fire trucks or the horse and buggies came in and out with the buckets of water, because Democracy Now! Has expanded so much to now broadcasting on 500 radio and television stations around the country. And what's amazing, and I think it's because of what happened and what the aftermath of September 11th, is how many NPR stations and PBS stations and some of the most conservative areas of the country are beginning to pick us up, because people across the political spectrum are hungry for independent voices they can trust. And I'm talking about the voices we open the microphone to, not that small circle of pundits in Washington who know so little about so much, who explain the world to us, and who so often get it wrong. But people like you, the experts in your own communities. This week in Minneapolis, there'll be 2 funerals for soldiers coming home. They can tell us about what the war in Iraq is about, those communities. We don't have to turn to those guys inside the Beltway who deny that it's not that bad. So here we are as we expand, but going back to September 11th, when we first went to television, the show then broadcast at 9 in the morning. We broadcast at 8 every morning now, and then the stations pick it up when they want to through the day. The first plane hit the first tower of the World Trade Center at 8:47. We didn't know it had happened. We're inside the firehouse preparing our show. 9:03, the next plane hit. We had already started our show. We were doing a special that day on the connection between terror and September 11th, 1973. The day Salvador Allende died in the palace in Chile, when the Pinochet forces rose to power. The U.S.-backed, Kissinger-backed, Nixon-backed Pinochet forces rose to power, killing thousands of Chileans over the next 17 years. September 11th is not the first time that date was connected with terror. September 11th, 1990, Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack died at the hands of U.S.-backed Guatemalan security forces. September 11th, 1977, Steve Biko, the founder of the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa, was being beaten to death in the back of a van by U.S.-backed apartheid forces, died in the early mornings of September 12th. September 12th also is, by the way, the birthday of Leonard Peltier, who remains in prison now in Pennsylvania. Yesterday, Mike Kuzma, one of his attorneys, was in court in Minneapolis arguing once again to get more documents released. At his trial, I think it was something like 1,800 pages were released. Now they were demanding 90,000 pages released. And that's not all of them. That's just at the FBI office in Minneapolis. This is 30 years later, and the government is still invoking that would be a threat to national security. 30 years later. But September 11th, 1971, Attica, the prisoner uprising at Attica, upstate New York, prisoners protesting prison conditions. 2 days later, the New York governor, Nelson Rockefeller, called out state troopers. They opened fire, killing 39 men, among them guards, critically wounding 88 others and injuring hundreds. September 11th is not the first time that terror came to our soil. Ask any African American about slavery. Ask any Native American about what has happened in this country. But it was horrible. September 11th united us with people around the world against terror. I'll end with this image, and that is the pictures going up all over New York City, thousands of Xeroxes of photographs of lost loved ones, photographs of a young woman holding her child, and it said, "If you've seen my wife last seen above the 20th floor of Tower 2, please call her husband," and there would be a phone number, or a picture of a young man. "If you've seen my son last seen in Tower 2, please call his mother," and a phone number. And I thought about how similar those pictures were to the mothers, those pictures held on the placards of the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina. "Have you seen my grandson? Have you seen my granddaughter?" September 11th united us with people around the world against terror. We have to have a uniform standard of justice whether we are American or Chilean or Argentine or Iraqi or Syrian or Lebanese. We have to have a uniform standard of justice. That's what's going to decrease the level of terror in the world that threatens us all, and a uniform standard of what terrorism means, the killing of innocent civilians, whether done by individual players or states or governments or countries. I'll end like I end every speech. We have a decision to make, and it's particularly important in an election year. We have a decision to make every hour of every day, whether we're journalists or activists or shopkeepers or bookstore owners, whether we're doctors, nurses, farmers, employed or unemployed. We have a decision to make whether to represent the sword or the shield. Democracy Now!